Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us from wherever you are and at whatever time zone you are for a session on the policy impact of basic income experiments. So my name is Jurgen de Wispelaere. I'm joining you from Valdivia, the south of Chile. It's 8 a.m. here. The whole point of this session is to discuss something that we feel is a bit neglected so far in basic income experiments, namely, what do we do when we have these scientific results? Do we see any real impact, however subtle? I mean, we know that basic income experiments haven't led right away to basic income implementation, but there might be all sorts of subtle ways in which nevertheless they do have an impact. So that's very much the topic of this session today. We have a stellar cast. So I should say, actually, before introducing the people, I should say that this is a follow-up from a special issue that Joe Chrisp and I have put together, which features, amongst other people, Heikki Hiilamo, who's here today as well, and Femke Roosma. That is a special issue that is focused entirely on the policy impact of European basic income experiments. But within this session, we also wanted to broaden it out. So we're also welcoming, Fabio and Steve to discuss more non-European perspectives. Those who are interested in the special issue, just go to the journal, the European Journal of Social Security. And just, the last issue has all these papers, and many of them are open access, so feel free to check that out. So in terms of people we have today, so we have Joe Chrisp, who is at the IPR of the University of Bath. He will actually present a model, a framework for discussing the policy impact. And then we have four commentators who will give shorter responses to this. So we have, first of all, we have Heikki Hiilamo, who's a professor of social policy at the Finnish Institute of Health and Welfare and the University of Helsinki. And perhaps worth mentioning, Heikki just published a book on participation income, which will have its own session in this Congress later, I think tomorrow officially. So anyone interested in participation income should check that one out as well. Next, we have Femke Roosma, who's an assistant professor of social policy or sociology, at Tilburg University. And Femke as well has contributed to this special issue I mentioned. We have Fabio Waltenberg, who works at the Universidade, I have to make sure, Universidade Federale Fluminense, and I apologize if I got that wrong, the order wrong, in Brazil. And Fabio also is one of the PIs of the Riga Basic Income Evaluation Project, so he knows everything about that. And finally, we have Steve Nuñez, who is the lead researchers on guaranteed income with the Jain Family Institute. So these people are also working with the Riga project. So Fabio and Steve know each other very well, of course. But then the Jain Family Institute is also involved in many of the basic income pilots in the US. So we get a bit of that perspective as well. So the way the format will be that Joe will be introducing this framework in about 15 minutes, and then we have short 7 to 8 minute commentaries of each of the speakers. So we were originally told that this was just going to be an hour, so we actually are going to keep to that. That's what we prepared. But it also means that, unfortunately, we really don't have any time for audience questions. So I kind of apologize for that in advance. I'm afraid this is a session where we're going to be talking amongst each other a little bit, but I hope you get a lot out of it. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Joe. Joe, you have 15 minutes to present your paper here. Thanks very much. Bye.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Jurgen. So you've given me a sufficient introduction that I should hopefully be able to go straight into the puzzle or the rationale for this paper, which, as Jurgen said, was a kind of systematic lack of research on the policy impact of the experiment. So we've seen a huge amount about, if you like, the theoretical or philosophical justification for the experiments, an analysis of the results, but very little about what's actually happened on the ground after these experiments. And in a sense, one of the reasons why we think this is a huge gap is that a lot of the time these experiments are not purely scientific projects by any means, particularly because they are instigated and funded in many cases, in most cases, by governments with political actors that have particular goals in mind when they supporting these experiment projects. So to treat them purely as scientific, if you like, exercises seems to be missing part of what the point is intended to be. And one of the other kind of narratives, if you like, that surrounds these experiments is one where, you know, there's a predictable cycle where a huge amount of excitement comes with the announcement that there may be some kind of experiment, slight disillusionment when the details of the experiment come out in a bit more detail, as they've probably had to compromise in some way when fleshing out the details, and then ending in a kind of disappointment. And in a sense, what we wanted to do was to kind of challenge this obsession with the sterile analysis of results, and also the prevailing narrative of failure, that all of these experiments have completely failed simply because no basic income has been implemented. And as Jurgen says, we think that there are some more interesting ways of picking apart what the consequences of these experiments has actually been in terms of policy. So if you like, a very cynical view of these experiments would be that they would be a kind of maximalist radical view that the scientific evidence has no bearing whatsoever on whether an experiment or a pilot has succeeded, and that the only thing that they serve is as a kind of battering ram to try and lead to some kind of implementation of UBI as a result of the experiment. On the other side would be the kind of minimalist or scientific view that policy impact really doesn't matter, and all that matters is the science. So if a pilot gives us great evidence and the science holds, then the experiment has been a huge success. So unsurprisingly, given that we've built these two straw men on either side, we take something in the middle of that, a kind of intermediate view that policy impact is important, but broader than just policy implementation, and insight in policy is all. So just to be clear about what we mean by impact, because I think the chronology is often quite difficult to think about when you pick apart what the experiment is and what its impact is. So we try to think of, if you like, three phases of basic income experiments. So you have the pre-experiment phase, where effectively building up the civil society campaign, political campaigns, whatever may precede what is eventually the government commitment to some kind of basic income experiment. And so, if you like, the experiment phase, in our view, starts just as the design team is appointed and announced, and the design of the experiment can start in earnest. Then, you know, throughout the running of the experiment, we would obviously count that as part of the experimental phase. And effectively, the experimental phase, in our view, ends as soon as the evaluation report is published. And so anything that happens after that, if you like, is what we might be interested in terms of impact. And the reason why you might wonder why we bothered to think of these phases is that in some way, the chronology matters, because things can happen during the experiment phase which we might attribute to impact, that cloud our judgment a little bit. So we've tried to limit it to things that have happened after the experiment phase, as a way of measuring the success of or the impact of these basic income experiments. So a key part of what we've tried to do is to unpack the different types of policy impact. And we've built on a kind of literature in public policy that looks at, first of all, the assessment of policies and their success, but also pilot projects in general. So not to do with basic income at all, but to do with the assessment of success in terms of pilot projects and policy making. And one thing that we've drawn from this is the importance in a kind of multi-dimensional assessment of success. And we've taken a kind of three-dimensional approach that is in the Marsh and McConnell article from 2010, where they distinguish between process, program, and politics. So we've adapted this for thinking about basic income experiments. And in our mind, process here is thinking about the production of knowledge, the effects and functioning of UBI models, the dissemination of results, and the stimulating of moderating of informed discussion based on the insight. So in a sense, this is the closest thing, if you like, to the sort of science dimension, but critically not just focusing on the production of the results, but also the dissemination of that results and how it relates to discussions. Then we have the kind of programmatic side or program, which relates to the introduction of new policies, the amending or updating of existing policies in line with UBI guiding principles, but it also may be some element in which the kind of policy infrastructure is built that facilitates potential steps towards UBI. And the key point here is we are taking an approach where it's not an all or nothing assessment. If there are certain steps or certain policy changes which we may consider in line with UBI guiding principles, that has had some kind of impact in relation to the experiments. And finally, a different dimension is the politics. So clearly an experiment can be perhaps a failure in terms of process and program, but still lead to increased awareness and support for UBI in the general public. It may secure support from certain politicians and political actors, and crucially may lead to the building of particular coalitions of actors that allow them to actually work out in what way they can collaborate in moving policy making forward in the future. So three complicating factors when we think about the impact. One is, when do we decide if a UBI experiment is a success or failure? Clearly, the impact of an experiment can change considerably over time, sometimes even decades, with Minkum being kind of the most obvious example of that, where it was buried for a very long time before it was eventually dug up 30 or 40 years later. But we think that a reasonable political time frame for thinking about the impact of an experiment that is in the hands of the designers of the experiment, if you like, or in the intentions of the designers of the experiment, is no more than 2 election cycles. So if we think about 2 election cycles, that gives us a reasonable time frame with which to assess the impact of a policy experiment. The second one is, where do we assess success or failure? And clearly Finland is a good example of this, because as Heikki, I'm sure we'll discuss in a minute, the experiment didn't necessarily have any positive impact within Finland, but did lead to a huge kind of impact abroad and internationally in terms of building support for basic income and interest in experimentation. So we think that although that is a really interesting dynamic that's happened with the Finnish experiment, really we should be thinking, because the instigators of the experiments often are primarily concerned with their host country, that this should be the primary location of assessment, whereas the rest of the impacts are kind of treated as unanticipated side effects. And the last complicating factor is, who gets to decide whether a UBI experiment is a success or failure? And this is really quite important, because there are all sorts of different political actors who will be involved in the instigation of experiments, and they will vary across different contexts, across different countries. And so this makes it quite difficult to compare across different countries. So one way that we've tried to, if you like, level the playing field, or to provide a kind of comparative perspective that all countries can relate to, is to adopt a kind of presumption in favor of UBI policy development as the default. So if we imagine that the extent to which the promotion of UBI and UBI-like policies is the impact that we are most concerned of, rather than, if you like, less intrinsic motivations for starting an experiment, such as increasing the popularity of specific political leaders or so on. So those are complicating factors, and we can perhaps discuss them, whether they make sense in the discussion, but the three that we did in order to kind of move the discussion forward. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the entire framework here because it's relatively simple. Effectively, what we imagine is that, if you like, you can scale the policy impact on a kind of mark scheme from negative impact, not necessarily in the normative sense, but just in terms of UBI policy development, neutral impact, and then minimal, significant, or full impact would be the kind of most amount of impact that you could imagine on any of the three dimensions. And this is just an illustrative framework. We haven't spent a long time deciding on these outcomes, and people are going to discuss. People who have studied these cases in a lot more detail will provide more interesting examples of this. The key point of these kind of policy impact country profiles is not to provide a kind of definitive account of how countries have succeeded or failed and to compare them across them, but to illustrate that different types of success or different types of impact can occur in particular countries. So, for example, in Scotland, where effectively the experiment didn't even happen, there was just a feasibility study. Clearly, there was no kind of process impact in any meaningful way. However, both in terms of policy change within the Scottish government and also in terms of the mobilisation of particular groups, clearly there was some relatively minimal but positive in terms of UBI policy development impact, despite the fact that no field experiment was ever actually run. So that's the main point that we wanted to make behind the kind of country profiles. In terms of providing the detail, we'll, I'm sure, hear from people in a minute about how they think this kind of framework applies to their cases. And so the last thing we wanted to think about, the point of this framework, is also to wonder what are the factors that drive policy impact. And one way we did this was to think about kind of groups of factors based on how much agency, in a sense, UBI advocates might have in terms of driving policy impact. So clearly at the least level of agency are the kind of institutional structural factors, or the where and when of basic income experiments. And these relate to the design or generosity of existing social security programs, political institutions that maybe facilitate decentralized policy experiments, but also the economic climate. And clearly, just to give an indication of one of the things we would perhaps hypothesize about what the impact of these factors are, the more generous and the more extensive the existing social security programs, perhaps the less potential for programmatic or the more barriers in the way of programmatic impact that these basic income experiments have. Whereas in cases where social security programs are relatively undeveloped, we may imagine that there are much greater space for impact in terms of policy. Likewise, in terms of, so moving down, if you like, from the institutional structural factors, we might think of political or actor-centered factors. So here we're thinking about the extent to which the actors involved are coming from a national government, so a top-down type process, or coming from more local governments or city governments, bottom-up perspective. And clearly, top-down provides far greater potential for programmatic impact, because they will have far greater levers at their disposal to drive policy change. But also things such as the existence of a pre-existing UBI community and the role of veto players, such as unions, civil service, and coalition partners, and so on, are going to be really important in terms of driving policy impact. And finally, if you like, the actual design of the experiments themselves are going to be very important. And we've just illustrated a few things, perhaps some broad factors that we might generalized from these experiments. One being perhaps the scale or the ambition of the project, how much money or resources is being put into these projects is likely to raise the stakes, as is framing this as a basic income or not. So our kind of basic theorizing of how framing the experiments as basic income matters is it, in a sense, it provides more opportunities for basic income specifically to build greater support, but also mobilizes more actors against the experiment and against policy development afterwards, because it's a far more divisive policy than, for example, framing it as experiments with social security in a broader sense. And clearly, so you, by not framing it as basic income, perhaps you limit your potential for radical change, but you perhaps increase the potential for minimal or incremental change. So those are just a few indications of some of the, if you like, the brainstorming that we did about what drives policy impact. We'd be interested to hear what people's views are on some of these factors. So really, if you like, our lessons are that policy impact matters for what are, to a large extent, inherently political experiments run by political actors and political governments. We think that the next step really is for research to look far more systematically into the policy impact of basic income experiments, thinking about models, indicators, country case studies, and comparative research to establish more clearly the patterns and drivers. But we think also perhaps there needs to be a step back a little bit as well in terms of thinking about the causation, because I think we cannot simply link the outcomes of experiments to the experiments themselves. And clearly, we have to think quite deeply about the extent to which experiments are moving with a tide, or the extent to which they are some kind of exogenous shock which will provide for certain policy outcomes. So that's all from me. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Very much, Joe. That was a lot of stuff trying to squeeze in a short amount of time. Well done. We'll hear back from Joe at the end of the session, just a couple of responses to some of the commentators. So next we have 4 commentators. We've asked the commentators to both reflect on what Joe presented, whether this model and this approach in general is useful or not, but also, of course, link it into their own specific experience. And, we have 4 people from very different parts of the world precisely for that reason. But without further ado, first, Heikki Hiilamo, 7 to 8 minutes, please, Heikki.
Okay, thank you, Jurgen, and thanks for putting up this interesting panel. So I'm going to talk about the Finnish case and give you a kind of a insider view or a domestic view on the experiment conducted in Finland and the political impacts of this experiment. So currently we have a completely female-dominated government consisting of 5 female party heads, most of them in their mid-30s, but the government which actually implemented this experiment looked very different. You could even say that it was a toxic male government of a conservative government consisting of a populist party, center party, and a conservative party. And as was already said, that attracted a lot of international interest, something which we couldn't anticipate before the experiment. And we tried to figure out why that was the case. Perhaps one of the reasons could be that it's fairly well known that we have a very well-developed welfare state model. So in a sense, we're in a pioneering country and an example for many other countries in developing their social protection systems. So I think that added some credibility to this idea of basic income. And of course, this experiment was quite unique in a sense that it was the first national field experiment on basic income. and the first major experiment since the negative income experiments in the US and Canada in the 70s. And the kind of interpretation of that experiment was that basically two things. One, that Finland would be interested in exploring basic income as a policy option in reforming social security system. And secondly, that government would base its decision on evidence provided by these robust scientific experiments. So this wasn't a randomized controlled trial experiment. So my contribution to that special issue was based on the hypothesis that both of these statements would be actually true. And just a few words about this experiment. I mean, it wasn't a full-blown universal basic income. It was just a partial basic income for those with flat rate unemployment compensation, meaning that it was targeted to young unemployed people without work history and those long-term unemployed who had extinguished their right for earnings-related unemployment compensation. And of course, there was an idea that there would be a kind of a saturation side included, but eventually that didn't fit into the experiment program, so it wasn't possible to evaluate the system level effects. But what was really special about this experiment was that it was a compulsory. Actually, a law was passed to implement the experiment, while most of the other experiments have been based on self-enrollment. So those people who are willing to participate, they are randomly selected into experiment and control group. While in this case, it was compulsory to receive basic income if you were selected into that group. And it was an experiment of 2 years. Eventually, it turned out that robust evidence was only gathered for 1 year, and I'll talk more about that in later. And the final results were released in May 2020. The evaluation results showed that despite this fairly big financial incentive, there was no there was not the expected increase in time spent in paid employment, but there were positive effects on subjective well-being. Of course, that result was not based on registered study, and it was not a kind of as robust evidence as the evidence for employment outcomes. What I provided in this article was a kind of a narrative review where I somehow borrowed this idea from the gospel. The story about Apostle Peter, which was described in the Gospels and Acts, where he denied Jesus 3 times during the events of the crucifixion. But in the context of this basic income experiment, I was actually able to identify 4 moments of denial. First of all, a social security project was established in 2017. And the aim of this project was to prepare for a major social security reform, a reform which actually has been started or was started by this new government. But basic income was not endorsed by the project, and actually there was no integration between the Social Security 2030 project and basic income experiment. So it was sidelined in the preparatory work for a major social security reform. Secondly, during the second year of the basic income experiment, another program was, an activation program was implemented. And that program had the exact opposite ideology to basic income. The idea was to increase conditionality in unemployment benefits to promote employment. And this actually invalidated the basic income experiments for the second year. So, and there was a kind of a complete policy turnaround, indicating that the government didn't really wasn't really interested in what's going to happen with this basic income experiment, because they implemented a completely different a policy during the second year. So actually, the results are valid only for the first year, and that was a huge disappointment for everybody who was following up the experiment. The third thing was that the Social Security Reform Committee was nominated, and it's appointed for 7 years, and it has a long-term plan for the structural and functional reform of Finnish social security. But basic income experiment or its results, or basic income as an idea, was not mentioned in the preparatory documents. And finally, the new government, they had in their program negative income tax experiment, and the idea was to somehow build a bridge from basic income experiment to this new experiment. But actually, there was yet another policy turnaround, and they didn't want to experiment negative income tax. Rather, they just experiment a tax credit, or actually they just made some preparations or discussion on how that could be implemented. So the original purpose of the experiment was changed, and it had no relevance to basic income debate any longer. So in conclusion, we can say that it appeared that the government wasn't really genuinely interested in integrating basic income into its plan to develop social security, and neither it was interested in the evidence from the basic income experiment to guide policy and in order to develop social security. So my take on this narrative review was that there was only just a cheap political support for basic income and no real commitment for implementing basic income. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Heikki. And let's immediately move on to Femke, please. Hi.
Everyone, and thank you, Joe and Jurgen, for organizing this panel, and especially also thank you for presenting this very interesting framework about and this work that you are doing on the impact of experiments on the policy outcomes in different countries. And I think it's very relevant because looking only at the scientific outcomes really distracts from the bigger idea of maybe the bigger dream of implementing UBI and focusing on too narrow details. So I really see also UBI as an initiative to changing maybe the system from within with smaller steps, and I think your policy framework contributes to that. And I have two bigger comments to the framework you propose, and maybe two smaller depending on the time. So maybe first to start, I'm actually a scholar of mostly public opinion, so I also study public opinion on UBI, and I would therefore maybe from my perspective argue that public opinion in your framework might be a little bit underexposed in the full equation. Yes, it's mentioned as an element of what you call political outcomes, but I think that it's more crucial than that, and that it can also function in itself as a main driver of actually political change, or maybe even programmatic change. And that it deserves a little bit more attention. And it goes also, I think, a little bit further than only looking at easy stats of support for public opinion in general, but more also looking at the depth of this support. For instance, because I think that, and then I maybe also make a reference to the Dutch case that I studied in the special issue you mentioned, that maybe there is some support for the general idea, but actually implementing UBI takes a big step further, and it's really unknown if the Dutch public would support this. And this is something you see maybe at the political level as well. One of the things that I show for the Dutch case is that a lot of progressive political parties have now included UBI or UBI-like proposals in their political programs, and actually they include more radical versions of it in time. However, I'm not 100% sure how they will stick up to these ideas when they are in a political coalition trying to formulate policy. So what is actually, is it this actually cheap political support or real political support? And it's also something that was mentioned in relation to the Finnish case. So I think that public opinion as well as political support needs some more depth in see how whether or not basic income is just a political idea or a popular idea, or deeper if there's deeper support. The second comment I had based on your framework is that is a concern related to the program outcome. And I think the program outcome is really relevant because it's about real policy change. However, I think that there's a risk that it might also work against going to a full UBI. Because as I see it from the Dutch case, I think that the experiments really led to some results also on the program level. In that sense, I might not fully agree with your assessment that there was a null impact, because I think at the local level there was really programmatic change related to, or as a consequence of the basic income experiments. However, it might lead to the paradoxical situation where the current social security program is improved and leads to better social security systems. However, this might is a big win then, of course, but make radical reforms less urgent. So in that sense, program might not be a stepping stone to a full UBI, but maybe an end game, and there's less need to have this radical reform. So the program outcome can maybe work against UBI. I think that's something that you should consider. Then, since I have time, I want to mention one more point of concern, and that is the local level. And I think that might be the reason why, for instance, you mentioned that in the Dutch case, at the program level, there's not a real impact, and that is true, because at the national level, nothing really happened yet. However, I think because in the Netherlands, a lot of these experiments, or actually all experiments, were local driven, and I think local policymakers did make changes in policy programs, social security programs that were related to these experiments. So I think this level might be even more crucial than now speaks from your overall story, because I think at the local level it's on the one hand easier to find also political support, but also policy changes might be more easily adapted. So I think that the local level can be maybe a crucial winner for UBI, and we see this also, for instance, in the Barcelona case. But it's not so clear now in your full program. Okay, then this was the third comment. I leave it at that. We have some time for other commentators. Thank you very much for this presentation, Joe and Jurgen.
Very much, Femke. That's a lot of food for thought, for sure. Okay, Fabio, you're up next. Fabio, are you there? Is Fabio? If Fabio's not respond, okay. So I see he's sending a message. Yes, okay. I'll leave it to you right away then. Just on mute. No, we can't hear you. Okay, we seem to have some technical problems with Fabio. Can we just move to Steve first, and then maybe Fabio, you can try and see if there's any mic problems on your end. So Steve, do you want to pick this up?
Sure, no problem. So I want to say thank you for having me, and also for working on this. I think this framework is great, and I really wish we had it a few years ago, honestly, because I think it would have perhaps helped with the guaranteed income pilot wave in the United States. So what I want to say, JFI has actually been thinking about this as well. We recently released a paper called The Political Economy of Guaranteed Income that is sort of investigating these sort of non-processed, non-experimental sort of impacts of the pilots. So this is great. Where great minds think alike. I think the U.S. case is interesting. The pilots that we've had are, maybe you wouldn't actually call them pilots. They are largely small experiments. They are RCTs, but they're usually, 50 or 100 or 150 people assigned to the program group. So they have very low statistical power. And in general, they are focused on a counterfactual that I don't find particularly interesting from an experimental position. It's give people money or not. Are they better off if they have more money? And the answer is sort of obviously yes. There are a few exceptions where there's experimentation with the details of the program in terms of how the money is actually being distributed or the frequency or amount, but those are pretty much the exception. So we're not really, I think, having much of an impact on the process dimension with these. At the same time, these are almost entirely implemented at the city level or the county level. They are using private funds or they are using public relief funds from the pandemic more recently. And in either case, there's no real discussion or providence for a permanent sort of funding scheme. These are really meant to be kind of temporary programs. They're not really something that could be scaled up. The cities in the United States don't really have a lot of levers to pull in terms of financing. So on that end, they don't really have any direct program development aspects because they really can't be scaled up and become the basis for a policy. So they really are very much political. And you often hear the term narrative change. Obviously that could lead to impacts on the program side through their political impact. And we are seeing some evidence over the last couple months or so that public opinion is shifting, albeit very slowly and gradually in the United States, towards at least a greater, one, familiarity, and two, comfort with something like unconditional cash assistance. However, as you guys have alluded to, it'd be very difficult, I think, to assign causality there. When you look at this pilot wave, because a lot of sort of changes were happening to public opinion over the last several years, even including prior to the pandemic. And then during the pandemic, the United States government had, of course, also provided stimulus checks and other sorts of expanded cash support. So it's very hard to disentangle the causality there. I think you could argue that the pilots, even before the pandemic, were really the consequence of a broader shift in public opinion that was already underway in the U.S. And abroad, including in the development space with Give Directly and unconditional cash becoming a sort of benchmark. Which isn't to say, of course, that it couldn't have a feedback effect in some way. So I think, though, if you assume for a moment, let's just assume for the sake of argument that the pilots are the ones creating this change in public opinion. I think then you have to ask, well, what happens if public opinion changes? And I think that's where the theory of change is a bit underdeveloped. And I don't mean your framework, I just mean more broadly. So in your framework, how do we get to that significant and full impact box in politics? That's the successful coordination and mobilizing for policy change, getting politicians on board, and really building a sort of a movement. I think when I think about public opinion, I think kind of in the Mansur Olsen and later public choice kind of thought, which is if you have widespread but relatively shallow support for basic income, that's not necessarily going to make an impact on policy, especially if there are small but very motivated and well-connected groups lobbying against it. And I think this idea, we just narrative change, people like guaranteed income and then 1,000 flowers will bloom is perhaps a little bit naive, and that advocates can't simply think of the pilots as messaging exercises, but really need to think about the pilots as opportunities, as hubs for coordination and for organizing. And in the United States, at least, we don't see very much of that. So I think, and I guess I'm going to try to keep this brief, right? I think as you continue to develop this framework, I think it's worth thinking about the different or additional sets of activities that those organizing pilots would have to engage in to get from one category within a dimension to the next. Being good at communications and messaging and promoting guaranteed income is one set of skills, but actually going beyond that and actually organizing the folks who are participating in the pilot and in the local communities to actually start pushing for change is another. I think another thing to do, which I think you guys have alluded to also, is to think about how the different dimensions are related to each other. They're obviously not independent, and you can see how a pilot could have both a direct effect on programs and also an indirect on programs through the politics channel. And the same could be the case for process, where some impact findings do over time sort of lead to additional material used in elite persuasion when it comes to the politics and program dimension. And of course, in general, just thinking through the relationship between these different factors that you've mentioned. So for example, in the United States, you might think that this is fertile ground for guaranteed income because we do have a relatively underdeveloped safety net, underdeveloped social insurance provision group, but we also have an enormous number of veto points in a kind of a hoary old federal system, which make it very difficult to pass policy changes and are in fact causal when you look at that safety, the limitations of the safety net. So that's all I really have to say. Just wanted to say once again, thank you very much. I think this is extremely important work, and I'm hoping that I can get it in front of the folks who are sort of organizing and coordinating the pilots in the United States. So thank you very much.
Very much, Steve. That was, again, a lot of interesting food for thought for us and anyone in general. Fabio, let's give this a try and see whether your microphone works now.
Hello, do you hear me? Is it okay now?
That's great. Okay, let's keep going.
Okay, thank you. So, good morning. Well, good morning for me, right? 9 a.m. here, maybe good evening, good afternoon for all of you. I'd like to thank you, Jurgen, and Joe for the invitation. It's really nice to be here. I'm really glad. Although maybe it was not, I'm not exactly the right person to talk here because first, I'm not an expert on pilots. This is one thing. And the second, I'm only an economist, right? So, I see that you have here sociologists, policy experts, and so on. So I'm not trained to think, let's say. I'm trained to think or to, in terms of optimizing subject to constraints, right? So with that in mind, I think there are 2 points which I wanted to talk about here, which are related to what happens in Brazil. The first is a kind of constraint comment, right? Which is, I think that it's very important to take into account the context, right? There is some kind of path dependence. And in this debates on UBI policy, and I'll give you an example, which is, of course, related to Brazil, but maybe some contrast with the Finnish case. So my point is that here in Brazil, every time you talk about UBI, all the debate is related to to poverty relief. It's related to social assistance. There are many reasons for that. It's not possible to go into the details, but a couple of points. The Constitution of 1988 created social pensions, and they are means tested. We had all this policy debate and policy implementation around conditional cash transfers in the 1990s and the 2000s. This is related to poverty relief. This is related to social assistance. Ironically, the law which Senator Eduardo Suplicy managed to pass a couple of years ago, like almost 20 years ago, it was approved one day before the very law of Bolsa Familia, the famous conditional cash transfer here. So the debates are really connected. They are associated. And this means that, we cannot subvert that. You cannot talk about UBI in Brazil if you don't talk about that. I'll give you another example of this related to what is happening in Brazil. We are involved in some studies and possibly with some advocacy in the near future for a in terms of citizenship, rights for children, and so on. I'm working with non-economists who like very much this approach. But when we present this, the audience all the time will ask about the poverty impact, something about inequality impact too, but really in terms of poverty. It will always be compared to Bolsa Familia or to Auxílio Brasil, which is the program which replaced Bolsa Familia. So I see this as a kind of constraint in the case of the Brazilian debate. So if there is some kind of policy here, it will have to be connected to poverty relief to a certain extent, even if we don't want to, even if we think that, UBI is something else. And I guess the contrast with Finland, as far as I know about it, and listening from Jurgen in an event we organized last year, is that in Finland the debate is much more rooted on unemployment benefit, right? So I guess that this is a constraint, and I would like to ask Joe and Jurgen, to what extent do you take that into account, right? The constraint of the context or the path dependence. To what extent is this included in your framework? And the second comment is about, also rooted based on what happens in Brazil. It's the optimizing side, let's say, right? With my economic training here, which is the evolution in Brazil of both the policies and the debates. It has not been smooth, organized, well-structured, not at all evidence-based. It was really a mess. And by that, I mean also not only the UBI policy and debate, but also the conditional cash transfers. It has been very messy. And yet, I think that both policies and the debates, they are evolving, right? If you take into account the conditional cash transfers, what happened? They started in municipalities. This is, related to many different characteristics of the Brazilian context, but essentially to the fact that it's very decentralized here. Our welfare state is decentralized. We have around 2/3 of social spending at the federal level, and then we have 1/3 in state and municipal levels. And there is some room for innovation, for policy experimenting. And from the municipal level, the conditional cash transfers, they were enlarged, they were brought into the national realm, right? And even very recently with COVID, we had this auxílio emergencial, this emergency benefit, which was also, a kind of chance. It was not something which came from experimentation, from, let's say, the scientific part, taking into account what Joe was talking about. And if you think about UBI, what is happening right now, and I don't want to be overly optimistic, we have to manage the expectations, but what is happening here is experimentation also at the municipal level, mostly with the Maricá policies and the Niterói policies. They are not UBI, they are not universal, they are means tested to some extent, but it's, they are unconditional. We have some interesting aspects there, and this is coming from municipalities which are by chance also because of oil revenues, they are rich and they are doing that. Maybe they could evolve to other municipalities. There are signs that this is happening, and at some point possibly to the national level. But they are policies, they're not experiments, they're not pilots, they're not controlled, they're not RCTs. It's absolutely different. And they don't even use the name UBI, right? In Maricá, it's more or less close because they call it the citizens' basic income. But in the case of Niterói, they call it simply social currency, right? So I guess that relating to your paper in that special edition, Jurgen and Joe, and to what we just heard, I think that some expressions I heard or I read there, like stepping stones, realistic expectations, public relations management, I think this is very useful. So the optimizing strategy here would be to foster many experiments and not to expect these to be extremely organized, Cartesian, and so on. It will be messy anyway, and we should try to find a way of, from all the information, from all the expertise we will obtain, I guess that's it. Thank you, and sorry for the technical issues here.
Thanks very much, Fabio. It's always good to end up on a messy note, and I'm not referring to the mic, but to your microphone issues, but to your comment about messy policymaking. I think that's a very, very important point indeed. We're sort of getting at 1 hour session, but since we're the last session of the day, I want to give Joe 10 minutes to just kind of pick up on a couple of points here and there, and then we'll wrap it up because, of course, the people in Australia have had a long, long day of conversing already. So, Joe, 10 minutes?
Yeah, no, there's lots of really, really amazing comments. To be honest, I'm going to be quite boring and basically agree with pretty much everything that people have said. So, in terms of thinking about public opinion, I completely agree that we haven't put it front and center, despite the fact that I think it is clearly, in a sense, it's the real battle of these experiments is trying to shape and control how they're perceived by the public. I guess one part of that is not just how it's received, but how many people receive it as well. And so getting, huge amounts of publicity as well as positive publicity is a key part of it. I think one of the reasons why it's underemphasized at this stage for us is because it's incredibly hard to evaluate changes in public opinion as a result of the experiment, at least partly for the reason that you mentioned that, we may even have surveys before and after about support for basic income, but often, these are for the principles of basic income in a very abstract way without any kind of sense of the extent to which they would really support a kind of basic income model that could be implemented. So, even if we have the kind of data on before and after the experiment, what do people think about basic income? I'm always a bit skeptical that we've got a very clear sense of how, tangible public support has actually changed. And in terms of the program outcomes and the fact that we put, zero impact on the policy dimension. I think we've actually meant to change that for the presentation. I think after reading your paper, Femke, because I do think it's important not to discount, relatively small but still significant changes, even at the local level, that may reduce the kind of behavioural conditions on recipients and make certain important changes there. So that wasn't our intention with the paper, and so it's important for you to mention that. But I think you raise also a kind of fundamental paradox, which I think pretty much all of the presentations after ours kind of alluded to, which is that positive change in the direction of UBI may actually make the full thing less likely in some way. So I think clearly there's a tension in our framework between, even if there are incremental steps. I mean, personally, from my own personal perspective, I'm more inclined to agree with the idea that these kinds of incremental change are, in a sense, what people should be struggling for, but that's not necessarily for me to decide alone. People have different perspectives on that. And I think clearly there's a tension between, reducing conditionality, which may actually solve a certain issue, whilst that also making UBI less likely. So I think that's an important thing to consider. And I liked very much that Steve touched on a number of really the key things that we have been considering. I think the causal question really is about how the experiment relates to perhaps the trends that were already existing beforehand. Perhaps they mediate the kind of process towards more support for basic income. Perhaps without the experiment, it wouldn't have had any kind of significant effect, so it may kind of moderate it in some sense. Or it may have had no effect whatsoever, and things like the kind of stimulus checks really swamp any kind of effect that the experiments do. So those kind of questions really what we want to kind of really explore in a lot more detail in future work. And I think the point I really liked as well was about the hubs for coordination, because I think in a sense that's what our framework is trying to do, really, is to force people to think about what the point of the experiments are, and to think about strategies for how, to use Fabio's phrase, to optimize the outcomes that they want. So if the point is to mobilize the public or stakeholders, or to create kind of coalitions of groups that will be able to further policymaking in the direction of basic income in the future, then just doing the experiments alone and using the evidence to try and make arguments with politicians is probably not going to be enough. And so using these experiments not only as kind of scientific endeavors, but also ways of mobilizing people and creating, to use Steve's words, the hubs for coordination, I think is a really, really interesting thing. And just to finish on the context and constraints, I guess, as we tried to sort of say in the presentation, I think it's the biggest part of the story is that, for the most part, welfare states exhibit path dependency. It's incredibly difficult to implement path-breaking policy reform, which is why we think it's important not to expect too much of these experiments in terms of programmatic progress. It's not realistic to imagine that an experiment with 2,000 people where 2,000 people receiving long-term unemployment benefits, having their conditions removed, will suddenly lead to the implementation of a full basic income in a context where that hasn't been the system beforehand. But clearly there are important things that can happen that do fit within the existing context. And I really like the idea of thinking about it as a messy one. And certainly at the local level, it does seem like, the kind of multiplicity of different experiments is in some sense a strength, because it allows for a kind of diversity of approaches. But I also do wonder the extent to which, if taking the American example, from what I've kind of seen, I mean, Steve will probably have a much better sense of it than me, but I wonder the extent to which a kind of very much framed as a national project might have had kind of more impact on the national debate. So I think there's trade-offs between perhaps kind of creativity and allowing diversity to really find its own way versus the kind of the real big hitting kind of media dominating effects of a kind of big national project. So I think that's something that we wanted to start a conversation about. I hope most people have found the kind of different perspectives quite interesting today. And I'd just like to thank all the people that have really responded to this so positively. We're really appreciative. I think there have been some really amazing comments and a lot for future discussion. So thanks very much to the panelists, and also for everybody either staying up late or getting up early to watch this discussion.
Thanks very much, Joe. And I just want to add my thanks to that. So thanks very much to the panelists, Heikki, Femke, Steve, and Fabio. Like Joe, I learned a lot. And in many ways, we kind of see this as a start of a new research agenda. As we mentioned at the very, very beginning, this is very much an underdeveloped aspect of the whole debate around the politics of basic income and basic income, the role of basic income experiments in there. So, and we're sort of both trying to figure out what is the right perspective to, what is the sort of model that we can use to get a better handle on that. And at the same time, of course, constantly learning from the actual cases. And, and in that sense, it was really, really great to learn from, Finland, Netherlands, Brazil, and the US, and try to see whether there are, complementarities or big differences and so on and so forth. I mean, this is very much the start of a road, and Joe and I hope to do quite a bit more work. But we especially hope to do that work with, the people here in the room and the people at home and so on and so forth. So it's an open invitation to start really, really thinking about this. I hope you enjoyed this session as much as I did, and I wish you all the best for the remainder of the Congress, or whatever it is that you're doing with your day or your night, and so on and so forth. So thanks, everyone, and bye-bye.